Today we will have our second guest for our showcase series of the Operations and Supply Chain Management Division. We have Professor Mark Pagell, who holds a share in global leadership and is a full professor of sustainable supply chain management at the University College Dublin. He was the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Supply Chain Management from 2016 until 2022. He was named a distinguished scholar for our division at the Academy of Management in 2020. I hope you got the prize because we were actually in the middle of COVID. So
eventually,
I hope
yes.
cool. And was received Marie Curie International Incoming Fellowship to study sustainable supply chain management. Dr. Pagell research has won a number of awards, including Best Papers, which we all know, in the Journal of Supply Chain Management, Journal of Operations Management, and the International Journal of Operations and Production Management. And probably while this short interview is happening, he will have maybe 200 more citations, but we'll see. So. Welcome, Professor, and thank you for your time.
No, it's great to be here, though. Now you've set very, very high expectations that I may or may not be able to meet.
Yeah, I confess that yesterday I shared on my personal Instagram account that I was actually doing this interview with you, and people were commenting like, oh my God, you are so lucky. And they were also telling other very bad Brazilian words, but very like, go for it. So I know this will be one of our most viewed interviews for sure.
So more pressure.
Can I start with our first round here?
Sure.
Cool. So what is your current research question that you are obsessed with now?
I guess what I'm obsessed with now, and it probably hasn't changed much in the last 5-ish years, is how you design production systems, supply chains that can meet their traditional customer-centric goals while being good for the people who work in them, the communities they operate in, and so on. In other words, how do we create socially sustainable supply chains that allow people to thrive and the business to thrive?
Cool. And what is one idea from your research that people should know? Talking more about this corruption thing and...
I guess one of the things they should know is that we tend to look in the wrong places to learn about how to create more sustainable supply chains, that we tend to look at big publicly held companies who have been in business for a long period of time, as opposed to looking at, new entrants, social enterprises, NGOs, B corporations, and so on, who tend to be where the kind of novel innovation is happening. So hopefully through, especially a lot of work I've done with co-authors over the last 4 or 5 years, getting out of looking at just the typical big publicly held companies and looking at these new types of organizations, we've disseminated that to some extent.
But do you think that in terms of this kind of choice that especially I think young researchers like me, we will obviously have a preference for big companies and the mainstream because we need to publish in the end and it's quite easier also to justify. Do you think this lack of interest or this void in the research is also a reflect of our publish or perish thing?
Actually, I think that we tend to talk about that trade-off, especially with doing something that's mainstream and well accepted versus something that's novel. That I think that there's a serious trade-off there that especially isn't well communicated to PhD students. So when you do something that looks very familiar, that uses very familiar data and so on, when you do submit that research, everybody knows what you're doing, but they also have 50 papers to compare it to. And so the expectations for the middle part of the paper go up dramatically. And so you are publishing or perishing not based on doing something interesting or important, but on how robust you did it methodologically. When you take the other path, because you're in a novel space, you tend to get a very different response from the reviewers. They may completely dismiss it. That does happen. But if they like it, rather than trying to poke holes in it, which is what happens with the incremental research, they, and often the editors, become very supportive in how do we get this paper published. So I don't think as a young scholar, certainly, and I give this advice to my PhD students, so we'll see if they agree with it. But I think as a young scholar that we often don't see the downside to that choice. And so if what you're truly interested in is occurring in big companies with easily accessed secondary data, have at it. But don't go into that space because you think it's going to be easier. It's just going to be a different set of problems when you get to the publications phase.
Okay, another question about PhD students' advice in general. What do you think is the worst advice that PhD students still follow?
Worst advice. Wow. Oh, that implies that I must be giving them bad advice or be in the room when bad advice is given. Probably some of the worst advice is about trying to publish too quickly. That when students start focusing on publishing as opposed to learning skills from the get-go, they never actually learn how to do research well. So I'm always surprised, you look at the trajectories of people's careers, and the students who start publishing at the beginning tend to put out, there's no nice way to say it, but more likely to put out a lot of rubbish. And if they get better at it, it takes them a very long time. While the students who wait longer and start publishing more robust research, more interesting research, and so on, they may take longer to get to their first couple of publications, but the work that comes after tends to be at a higher standard, more impactful, and so on for most of their career. So I think rushing into publishing ends up being a quicker way to get your PhD and bad for your career.
Thank you. And going in this research direction, when you start a research paper or a research project in general, do you have any specific strategy of, inviting who are you working with, or thinking in a framework? You already target a journal. What do you usually do?
So and remember, I've been at this long enough that I can do things that this is probably not something I would suggest for a PhD student, but I want to be working on projects that might get published at someplace like Science or Nature. And I figure if that's our starting point, that we have set the bar incredibly high for contribution and for methodological rigor. And you'll note we haven't crossed that bar yet. But if that's our starting point, that wherever we end up will be something that we can be proud of. So it has to be a very important question. It has to be answered as well as we can. And so when I'm looking for people to work with, they have to share that goal, because if you accept that goal, you're also accepting that the research is going to take longer. And again, I probably have the luxury of doing that maybe you don't. But that's how I go about doing research today.
Yeah, but hopefully at some point of my career, I'll be a picky researcher.
There you go. Too. Right.
I'm confident. So a more polemic question here, but I really want to hear your opinion. If you can share, if you don't want to share, it's fine too. But what is a paper that everyone loves, but you kind of dislike or disagree?
So I've been waiting most of 30 years to tell this story. So I'm not going to quite answer your question, but it's related. When I was, I think in the last year of the PhD program, I got an interview at basically one of the Ivy League schools in the US. And it was meant, going to one of the best universities in the world and moving back to the part of the world that I grew up in. And, I did my research presentation in the morning, and then we went out to lunch, and the afternoon was pretty light. And we went out to lunch, and it was like 10 faculty and me. And they were all dressed like I am today. And I was in an ill-fitting, cheap suit. And we get to the restaurant, and they're like, first thing they say is, if you want a beer or a glass of wine, have at it. And of course, I demur because, well, that would be unprofessional. That's followed by all of them ordering a drink. So already I've got strike one, right? That I haven't picked up on the local culture. And then like 15, 20 minutes into lunch, they're bombarding me with questions. I'm already feeling very jealous. That would be nice to have a beer in front of me for this experience. And one of them asked me, name a theory that you hate. And I realized that whatever answer I give is going to piss somebody off the table. And rather than being myself and just saying whatever came to mind and pissing someone off at the table, I like hemmed and hawed. And I gave, and it's an answer I agree with, but it's a pretty crap answer, that I talked about really disliking the theory of constraints, more because the book, The Goal, while I get that, trying to get students to engage with the material through a novel has its uses, but the actual writing is horrific. The storytelling is bad and so on. And so I went with that answer, which of course was not very good, as opposed to, talking about something like the resource-based view, which was very useful at some point in time, but at this stage, it's been, changed with dynamic capabilities and all sorts of other stuff, and there's really no need to use it anymore, right? So the lesson from that was more about being myself, that I probably wasn't going to get a job in an Ivy League college regardless, but I certainly wasn't going to get the job after A, missing out the cultural cues, and B, not, being a strong advocate for what I believed.
Thank you for sharing this. Well, I guess it was an amazing experience and uncomfortable at the same time.
Yeah, it was a bit traumatic at the time. I guess the good thing was that happened at a job that I had low expectations of getting. In other words, if that had been an interview where I really thought I could get the job, it probably would have been worse.
Okay, in terms of also job interviews and this kind of things, do you have any, especially because people are now approaching AOM and they will be attending the job market in general? We are, I think, in a very specific year with many polycrisis, with general polycrisis in general. Any suggestions of how to face these times as a candidate? I already got a job, so it's not. I actually received my offer letter this week, so no.
Congratulations. Right, so this is for other people. That's probably better. Obviously, this is clouded not necessarily by my experience, but by the fact that UCD is hiring this year. But we can certainly see in the applications that we're getting people applying who probably wouldn't have applied in the past. The best short-term advice I can give, and this is something that I actually did during the PhD program, so the job market sucked when I was supposed to graduate, that my university, Michigan State, gave me basically the option to drag out the last year of my PhD into a fifth year in return for doing some teaching. And taking that extra year and having the PhD completely done and getting an extra paper or two published and so on, while the world either got better or worse, but at least you had a better sense of where it was going, that made getting a job dramatically easier. So this is not the time to be trying to rush to get out. That's, of course, easy for me to say on a full professor's salary. The other thing I would note, having read about 150 application letters in the last couple months, is I get taking your CV and taking the job posting and so on and plugging it all into AI and telling AI to write you a cover letter. But those cover letters all look identical because everybody has done that. And so we're in our second round of hiring. In the first round, I think we got 150 applicants. I would say only 20 or 25 had cover letters that told us anything other than what the job posting said. Taking that a step further, many of them didn't tell us why they want to work at UCD. And in a job market that sucks, this is a buyer's market. So if we have the choice of 4 or 5 or 6 people who are really good, none of them might have applied to us in the past, one of the things that's going to increase your likelihood of getting the interview and getting the job is us knowing that you actually want to be here, as opposed to you're just desperate for a job. We know you're desperate for a job, but we would prefer to know you want to be here and you know why you want to be here and so on, right? In other words, we might lose you in 5 years, but show us that you're going to be a good colleague in that time period, right? There are people you can work with, there are ways you can contribute to what we do, and so on.
And anything for the interview times? Personally, I will mention this because I think it's also important for people to know. I had 3 different mentors from different countries and different institutions doing mocking interviews with me over and over again to train me. So any other suggestions of how to train for interviews?
Yeah, I think that's practice your presentation and then practice it another 20 times. Practice it in front of people you don't know or who don't know much about what you do, because a lot of the people in the interview they're not going to ask you the obvious questions or the questions you would ask. They're going to ask something weird because, well, that's what they care about. And
ChatGPT won't help you on the questions too, okay?
Yeah, there was no ChatGPT when I was interviewing, but from what I've seen, no, it's not very useful for that, because you can't predict what people are going to ask you. And practice how you're going to deal with when the questioner is right, you've screwed something up, or you don't have an answer. In other words, it is almost inevitable that someone is going to find a flaw in your research that you have never thought about before. And you need to be able to manage that process. Thank them for their insight, make it clear that you've written down what they told you, so have a pad and paper sitting there. Tell them that you need to think about it, but it's something you want to fix. Ask them if it's okay. You can follow up with them afterwards, either after the formal interview or maybe in the future via email, in order to make it very clear that you think this is important. Both because, well, of course, that will change their impression of you, but because odds are a viewer is going to ask the same question eventually. So I would be getting better at that, because I think a lot of us, when we get those questions and our immediate response is, oh shit, followed by cover our asses. And that just makes it worse, right? Where you're just kind of babbling and walking around the question and so on. That going right at it and saying, okay, you're right, I screwed up or I missed that, and I want to fix it.
So a question more personal, I guess, not personal, but like of your own beliefs and your life, your academic life in general. At some point of your career, did you have any moment that you thought, it's not for me, I'm leaving, I'll leave academia?
Yeah, so we were talking about earlier, graduating in a really crappy job market. So my first appointment was a 1-year visiting appointment, where all I did was teach. And it was a far from good experience. And during that year, it was still hard to get a job. So it took I don't think I had a job until April or May of that year. And, by the time we got to February, we started talking about, what else I could do, where we might move and so on. So it was pretty certain that I was going to quit academia at that point. It just did not seem to be a very good idea at the time. That was probably when it was worst. It doesn't come back all that often now, but again, I'm at the stage of career where why would you quit?
And when did you know that you actually belonged to this academic life?
When I got tenure. So, it took a while. So yeah, probably when I got tenure, and you kind of knew that, all right, you think you're doing the things that are both what the profession requires, but they also have to be things that you're comfortable with, that are true to you. And you don't know if those two things are really working together until you've got that, kind of sense of permanency.
Where, in which institution were you? Sorry, just.
No, that's fair. I was at Oregon State University, so in the U.S.
Okay, just to know, because it's depending on the country too, the
Right.
tenure can be like very difficult or not.
Yeah, so like tenure in the US tends to be a relatively high bar, much like getting a permanent contract in Ireland tends to be a pretty high bar.
One last question about papers and things, and then the final ultimate question. So, how do you deal with rejections and paper rejections in general?
Poorly, like most of us. Yeah, that's interesting because we've been doing sessions with the PhD students about that, and learning how to deal with rejection seems to be one of the better predictors of people who are going to be successful in academia, from my perspective. In other words, everybody who gets into a PhD program is very bright, has good ideas, could probably do the intellectual part of the job. In my experiences, it's the people who are bad at rejection. Not bad in the sense that it pisses them off, but don't have a way to deal with it and then, go back and do it again. Um, but we all also deal with it very differently. What works for me might not work for you. So, I mean, I typically see that the paper was rejected. I may skim the comments. I may not even bother with that. And then I put it away for a couple weeks. I want to get to the point where it's not an emotional process. I need to accept that the paper has been rejected before I start dealing with the response. And I've seen with co-authors more than once where they start the revision immediately, and either they overreact to comments or they're writing a pissed off letter to the editor when the reviews were actually fair or whatever. So that's probably the most important thing. And then I try and go do something that I enjoy, whatever that might be at the current time, whether it's going for a walk in the woods, whether it's going to the pub with my friends, whatever, to remind myself that, well, you know what, in the grand scheme of things, I can fix that. And while it's, we can claim it's your paper that got rejected, but realistically, it's also you and your ideas and so on. But that if I believe in them, I know that I can usually take the comments, make the paper better, and eventually get it published. So a lot of it's just trying to separate the emotional part, which I think is inevitable, from the response.
Yeah, I know I'm in a very young position here, like a junior position, but I tend to do the same. My co-authors, they usually go through the review right as soon as they get the reviewer thing, and I'm like, no, I will see after a week, after whatever. It won't change. Like once you got the rejection, it won't change that much. So I'm glad that I'm doing not the right thing, but I'm doing the the thing that Mark Pagell would do.
I think more importantly, you're doing something that works for you, that
Yeah.
allows you to take the feedback on board and do something useful with it.
Yep. So our final question, what has been your most memorable Academy of Management experience?
My most memorable Academy of Management experience. Wow.
Receiving the Distinguished Scholar Prize during COVID, definitely.
Well, that's certainly memorable, but getting a prize like that via Zoom, I'm not sure those are the types of memories that you're going to cherish for the rest of your life. In a lot of ways, it was probably the first time I went because
PhD student time or not?
I think so. Certainly early in career, and certainly I had attended a number of supply chain specific conferences or operation specific conferences before that. But to walk into a space with that many people, most of whom were in other areas, many of whom were like, global academic superstars, was life-changing, but it was certainly eye-opening about, what a conference experience could be about, as opposed to, just sort of staying within your own circle. So it was probably the first time I went. Not that getting a Distinguished Scholar Award is, of course, quite nice, but it was, circumstances weren't necessarily awesome. That said, now that I think about it.
Just to finalize this interview, we will share our very exclusive image of this very promising, I'm sorry for my accent, but whatever, this very promising PhD student. It was PhD student time or not?
Yeah, PhD student.
Et voilà, as we say here in France. We can observe how happy he was with everything. Any particular comments about this moment?
I'm pretty sure that picture was taken right before one of the other PhD students shaved my hair off.
Is this like a thing that people do because in Brazil we do, but when we first enter in college, not PhD.
It's a thing you do when the job market's really terrible.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, so I think that, I could be wrong, but I'm fairly certain that was the night that one of the other PhD students who had been in the military got his clippers out. And I went home looking very differently.
Okay, so please, people, avoid this kind of situation, or if you are very superstitious, you can do the same, and maybe someday you will be a distinguished scholar of Academy of Management.
Or maybe I would have got there sooner if I hadn't cut the hair off.
Maybe. Okay, thank you very much.